Snow falls without mercy upon the abandoned camp. Soft as ash, relentless as judgment, it drifts through the torn mouths of canvas tents and settles upon broken lances as if laying them gently to rest. Pennons once bright with saints and rampant lions sag beneath the weight of it, their colors swallowed by white. The wind moves through the encampment like a thin, grieving widow, slipping between guy ropes and rattling loose iron fittings with a hollow, funereal clatter. A horse lies on its side near the edge of the clearing, ribs rising in shallow, exhausted tremors. Its breath spills into the air like a fading ghost. No one comes to lift it. No one has the strength. Beyond the frost-stiffened hedges, a church bell tolls in measured Latin cadence. Not for the army. Not for the king's banner. It tolls for villagers who have already barred their doors and drawn shutters tight against the coming dark. The sound drifts across the fields, solemn and indifferent, as if heaven itself has chosen its prayers carefully this winter. Smoke coils from dying campfires, thin and bitter. It stings the eyes and clings to wool cloaks stiff with old sweat, damp oak, and the iron scent of unwashed mail. The men sit close to the embers, their faces hollowed by shadow and hunger. Snow gathers on their shoulders, and they do not brush it away. They have marched for months beneath that banner. They remember when it first caught the wind in summer, how it snapped proudly against a sky the color of polished steel. They had sworn fealty upon relics sealed in gold. They had kissed iron crosses and spoken vows in hushed Old French and thick Saxon dialects. Their words had felt heavy then, sacred as cathedral stone. Honor had been a visible thing. It shone in polished mail and rang bright as steel upon steel. It lived in tournaments beneath fluttering ribbons and in courtly feasts where trenchers overflowed with roasted boar, black bread brushed with honey, and wine dark as crushed berries. It lived in laughter and applause, in the firm clasp of a lord's gauntleted hand. But winter is a patient thief. It does not charge at the gates with banners raised. It seeps beneath doors. It strips flesh from bone and certainty from creed. It turns bright colors to ash and makes every oath taste thin upon the tongue. Supply wagons lie stranded miles behind, axles frozen deep in rutted roads that have hardened like iron. Salted pork has run rancid in its casks. Barley rations have dwindled to a scattering of husks at the bottom of sacks gnawed by rats and despair. Men soften leather, straps over fire, and chew them slowly, as if tasting memory itself. A knight sits apart from the others, his helm resting beside him in the snow. He removes his gauntlet with stiff fingers and studies his own trembling hand. The veins stand out pale beneath skin drawn tight by cold. He flexes his fingers once, twice, as though testing whether they still belong to him. Which oath binds him now? The one he spoke before God, beneath painted vaults and candlelight, or the one his stomach whispers at dusk, low and insistent? He closes his hand into a fist, but the shaking does not stop. Villages along the march have barred their gates with thick oak beams. Watchfires burn along palisades, and silhouettes move cautiously behind them. Law in these lands is clear. Those who pillage without sanction are brigands. They swing from roadside gibbets, crows tearing at what winter leaves behind. Yet law was written in seasons of harvest. It was etched into parchment when granaries were full and wheat fields rippled like gold beneath a generous sun. It was not forged in winters that crack the earth like shattered pottery, when frost blooms like white roses across shields and beards grow heavy with ice. A captain stands near the largest fire, its flames no higher than his knee. His cloak is lined with fur once soft and regal, now it hangs matted and stiff. He listens as his men speak in low tones. Their voices are hoarse, stripped of bravado. I saw a child at the last village, one mutters. She held a loaf in her arms like it was a babe. My son will be walking now, another says quietly. If he still lives, no one answers that. They speak of wives with flour-dusted hands, of fields that will not know their plow this year, of the simple holiness of bread torn and shared. The words hang in the smoke, thick air, fragile as frost. Honor begins to feel like a cloak too thin against the wind. The captain turns his gaze toward the dark outline of a village nestled beyond the trees. He can see the faint glow of hearth fires through shuttered windows. He imagines the smell of warm stew, the rough crust of barley loaves stacked upon a wooden board. He imagines children tucked beneath wool blankets, unaware of the army crouched in the snow beyond their fields. He knows the law. He knows the penalty. He also knows the sound of a man dying quietly because he chose obedience over bread. The church bell tolls again, slower now. Each strike seems to measure not the passing of hours, but the thinning of restraint. Snow thickens. It settles over shields and helms, over relics sewn into surcoats, over the lion embroidered in gold thread upon the banner. The saint's face is almost entirely obscured. The knight with the trembling hand rises at last, his joints protest. He does not reach for his helm. He does not speak of glory. He walks toward the captain. Their eyes meet in silence. No grand speech passes between them. No invocation of king or country. Only a shared understanding, heavy as stone. Behind them, a man begins to weep softly. Not for lost comrades, not for the enemy. For bread. The first door is broken, not with triumph, but with apology trembling in the breath of men who once believed themselves righteous. The oak beam splinters under the weight of armored shoulders. The sound cracks through the frozen air like a shot of thunder. Inside, a woman screams. The soldiers hesitate for a heartbeat that feels like a lifetime. They see the fear in her eyes mirrored by their own. One lowers his gaze. Another removes his helm as if entering a chapel. "We will take only what we must," the captain says, though his voice lacks the certainty it once carried. They move through the cottage with hands that once wielded swords in tournaments and now sift through sacks of grain. A loaf is lifted. A cured ham. A handful of onions braided together. Each item feels heavier than mail. Outside, the church bell continues its indifferent toll. In the days that follow, more doors give way. Some villagers resist. Some kneel and offer what they have in trembling hands. The line between soldier and brigand blurs beneath the snow. Rumors spread faster than frost. In the next village, gates close earlier. In the next, watchmen notch arrows with fingers numb from fear. The army, once welcomed as defenders beneath holy banners, becomes a shadow at the edge of hearthlight. Around campfires that burn brighter now with stolen wood, the men eat. Their cheeks regain a hint of color. Strength returns to their limbs. But something else has thinned. When they lift their eyes to the banner, they no longer see saints and lions as clearly. They see the broken door. They hear the woman scream. They feel the tremor in their own voices. Winter has taken more than flesh. It has taken certainty. And as the snow deepens, burying the tracks between camp and village, a different hunger begins to stir among them, one not so easily quieted by bread. For if honor can be bent once, under the weight of cold and fear, what else might break when spring finally comes? The wind moves through the camp again, carrying with it the distant echo of another bell. Not a warning this time, not a prayer, a summons. Somewhere beyond the white horizon, forces greater than hunger are gathering. Lords will hear of broken gates. Bishops will speak of sin. And among the ranks of this weary army, doubt will take root like a seed beneath the snow. For winter is not the only thief stalking these lands, and what it has begun to unravel, others are waiting to tear apart. The river has frozen solid. Under a moon as pale as bone, its surface gleams like a sheet of dull silver stretched tight across the earth, silent and merciless. Torches tremble along its banks, their flames bending in the wind as soldiers step cautiously forward, spear shafts extended before them. They strike the ice and listen, not with their ears alone, but with their bones, for the hollow crack that means death yawning beneath their boots. The air tastes of iron and smoke. Every breath scrapes the throat raw. Somewhere behind the line of men, a mule stumbles. Its legs fold slowly, almost with dignity, before it collapses into the snow. Steam rises from its nostrils like incense in a cathedral nave, curling upward in fragile spirals before dissolving into nothing. No one rushes to lift it. They watch in silence as its breathing slows, then ceases. Another burden surrendered to winter. The army has followed this river as if it were a sacred guide. It winds through the land like a promise, a silver thread stitching villages and fields together. But now it has led them only deeper into winter's dominion, into a place where sound carries too far and mercy carries nowhere at all. When they left the cathedral city in autumn, bells rang in triumph. Priests in white vestments stood upon the steps and raised their hands, sprinkling holy water that glistened like dew upon chainmail. Banners embroidered with saints and lions were blessed in high Latin, each syllable rising like smoke toward heaven. The men had knelt in orderly rows, heads bowed, convinced their cause was righteous and their hunger temporary. They were promised spoils, grain from conquered fields, coin from merchant towns, wine stored deep within vaulted cellars. The campaign was to be swift, the enemy unprepared, the harvest plentiful. But campaigns that begin beneath golden skies rarely account for the tyranny of frost. Now the fields they pass lie stripped and barren, furrows hardened into ridges, sharp as broken pottery. Scarecrows lean like condemned men beneath layers of rime. The wind sweeps across open land without obstruction, biting through wool and leather, slipping beneath armor to settle in the marrow. In villages along the riverbanks, peasants have hidden what little rye remains. Clay jars lie buried beneath hearthstones, beneath loose floorboards, beneath fresh earth in the corners of barns. The smell of boiled cabbage drifts faintly from shuttered cottages, thin, watery, but warm. It carries across the frozen fields like a cruel whisper. The quartermaster stands beside a wagon whose wheels are locked in ice. Once he wore a fur-trimmed cap and kept ledgers with neat, confident strokes. Now his beard is rimmed with frost, and his fingers tremble as he counts empty sacks. He knows the arithmetic of starvation as intimately as a priest knows his psalms. 1 more week and men will begin to desert. 2 more and they will begin to betray. He does not speak these numbers aloud. They exist in the lines around his eyes, in the way he avoids meeting the captain's gaze. Among the ranks are boys scarcely old enough to shave. Their cheeks remain smooth beneath grime and windburn. They were taken from villages that speak dialects the nobles barely understand, from cottages where the smoke smells sweeter and the bread is coarse but sufficient. They clutch rosaries carved from olive wood or bone, their fingers moving over beads polished by fear. At night, beneath threadbare cloaks, they whisper prayers learned at their mother's knees. Sancta Maria, ora pro nobis. The words come softer each evening, fading into chattering teeth. Hunger erodes not only muscle but memory. It makes saints seem distant and lords irrelevant. It narrows the world to a single thought repeated over and over like a tolling bell. Bread. The code of chivalry had been taught in halls adorned with tapestries, knights kneeling before queens, dragons vanquished, maidens spared. It spoke of mercy, of restraint, of honor toward the weak. It was recited as scripture, woven into the very fabric of noble identity. But here, along the frozen river, the weak are the only ones who still possess grain. The contradiction coils like a rope around the heart. Under a tattered pavilion stiff with frost, commanders gather in council. Their breath clouds the air between them, forming brief ghosts that vanish before judgment can settle. Maps lie unrolled upon a makeshift table, corners weighted with daggers. "We cannot press on without supply," one says quietly, his voice stripped of ceremony. "And we cannot turn back," another replies. "There is nothing behind us but snow and the memory of broken doors." They speak in careful tones, as if the river itself listens. Outside, the men test the ice again. Spears strike. Boots edge forward. A cautious line forms, shields slung across backs. The first soldier steps onto the frozen surface. The ice groans beneath him, a low, ancient sound that vibrates through the soles of his feet and into his chest. He pauses. For a heartbeat, all movement ceases. The wind stills. The torches flicker but do not sway. Then He takes another step. Soon the entire column advances, boots thudding against the frozen skin of the river. The sound echoes strangely, hollow and amplified. It is as if they march not upon water, but upon a drum stretched tight by winter's hand. The mule's body is left behind on the bank, already dusted in snow. Midway across, a crack snakes outward from beneath a soldier's heel, a thin white vein racing through the silver surface. A cry rises, sharp, instinctive, but the ice holds. For now, the army moves faster. On the far bank, villagers watch from behind trees and shuttered windows. They see not holy banners, but hollow faces. They hear not hymns, but the dull thunder of boots upon ice. Fear settles in their stomachs like a stone. The priests had promised that God marched with this army, but God feels very far away tonight. As the last of the column steps onto solid ground, the river groans once more, a long, aching sound that lingers in the air. It is not only ice that fractures beneath the weight of marching men. Something older, more sacred, splinters quietly within them. A knight who once swore to protect the innocent glances toward a cottage chimney, releasing a thin ribbon of smoke. He imagines grain hidden beneath the hearth. He imagines the faces inside, lined with hunger, yes, but still intact. He feels the rope of contradiction tighten further around his chest. Behind him, a boy murmurs a prayer and falters mid-syllable. He cannot remember the next word. The river lies behind them now, a frozen mirror reflecting a sky drained of warmth. They have crossed it. They have survived it. But survival has begun to demand a different currency. As the army reforms its ranks and the torches press onward into the white horizon, the wind rises again, carrying with it the distant barking of dogs and the faint creak of wooden gates being barred. Winter has tightened its grip. And somewhere ahead, beyond the next bend in the river's path, beyond the next cluster of cottages, waits a choice that will test not their strength, but the very meaning of the vows they once spoke beneath cathedral light. The ice held tonight. But how much longer will what lies within them endure the same weight? Dawn arrives without color. It spreads across the encampment like watered milk, thin and indifferent, draining what little warmth the night's embers had preserved. Frost clings to helmets and eyelashes alike, turning men into pale statues of themselves. Their beards are rigid with ice. Their cloaks crackle when they move, stiff as bark. For a moment, in the hush before orders are given, they look less like an army and more like relics, figures carved from salt and sorrow. The sound that carries farthest is not the clash of weapons. It is the cough. Dry, rasping, persistent. Lungs that have known too much smoke and too little warmth protest with every breath. The coughs echo through the cold air, each one a reminder that the enemy is no longer across a battlefield. It is within their chests. A crow perches upon a broken cartwheel at the edge of camp. Its black feathers gleam against the white, a single blot of ink on a page wiped clean. It tilts its head, watching with patient understanding. It has seen armies before. It knows how winter writes its endings. Months ago, in the great hall before departure, dawn had carried color, golden firelight against carved oak, banners glowing crimson and blue. Lords stood upon rush-strewn floors and raised chalices of spiced ale. Their words flowed in polished Norman French, smooth as the wood of the long tables. Pages moved through candlelight, trimming wicks of beeswax that burned sweet and steady. Minstrels plucked at rebecks and lutes, melodies weaving through laughter and clinking goblets. Honor was spoken of like scripture. It promised immortality through reputation, remembrance through song. It was rehearsed and admired, syllable by syllable, until it felt solid as stone. Young knights listened with hearts swelling beneath embroidered surcoats. Even the conscripted boys believed, for belief was easier in warmth. Now there are no songs. Only the crackle of damp straw beneath boots. Only the quiet shuffle of men rising from restless sleep. The banners, once bright, hang heavy with frost, their saints dulled by rhyme. No minstrel plays to steady trembling hands. From beyond a stand of pines, a faint chime drifts through the morning air. A chapel bell, small but clear. Its sound threads between trees and over frozen ground, unhurried and precise. A monastery stands hidden among those pines, its stone walls the color of old bone. Within its cloistered arcades, monks rise before dawn as they always have. They follow their rule with quiet obedience, chanting psalms beneath arches that trap their breath in pale clouds. They bake coarse bread in ovens fed with precious wood. They tend herb gardens sheltered beneath rough coverings of burlap, even now beneath snow. They have vowed poverty, yet they possess the only warmth for miles. Scouts return to camp with frostbitten fingers and cautious eyes. They speak of vaulted cellars carved from stone, cool and secure, of sacks of grain stacked neatly against the walls, of jars of honey and dried peas meant for alms and for spring sowing. It is meant for charity. It is meant for the hungry. And the army is hungry. The quartermaster listens without blinking. The arithmetic he carries in his mind sharpens. One more day of half rations, perhaps two. After that, discipline fractures like thin ice. The commander walks alone toward the monastery gates. Snow crunches beneath his boots. His cloak trails behind him like a shadow, unwilling to follow further. The ironwork of the gate is cold even through his gloves. He traces its pattern absently, crosses intertwined with vines. He remembers being a boy in walls like these, cold stone beneath bare feet, the cadence of Latin psalms echoing in narrow halls, the stern gaze of an abbot who spoke softly but never twice. He remembers hunger then too, but it was chosen. It was penance. It had purpose. This hunger has no him. The bell within the cloister rings again, steady and calm. Not a warning, not a plea, a witness. Behind him, his men gather in silence. Their faces are drawn tight with expectation and shame. No one speaks of glory. No one mentions oaths sworn over ale and candlelight. The contradiction has become too large to ignore. To take the grain would be sacrilege. To leave it would be death. Hunger is a tutor harsher than any abbot. It whispers in the marrow. It strips language down to its simplest truth. It asks questions that theology cannot soften. Does God prefer vows kept or lives preserved? The commander closes his eyes for a moment. He imagines the monastery's refectory, long wooden tables, bowls of thin broth, brothers eating in silence while one reads from Scripture. He imagines the sacks of grain below, counted carefully against the coming spring. He also sees his men. The boy whose prayer faltered upon the frozen river, the knight whose hand trembled as he stared at a cottage hearth, the quartermaster's hollow gaze. He opens his eyes. The gates do not open willingly. They yield beneath the weight of armored shoulders and the steady push of necessity. Wood groans. Iron protests. Snow falls from hinges in small avalanches. Inside, monks stand in their black habits, faces pale but composed. They do not flee. They do not curse. One old brother grips a rosary carved from dark wood, his knuckles white. "This is consecrated ground," he says softly. The words hang in the air like incense. The commander removes his helm. Frost clings to his hair. "So are we," he replies, though his voice lacks the confidence it once carried. The bell begins to ring again, not in welcome, not in alarm, in witness. Soldiers move through the cloister with hesitant steps. Their boots echo against stone floors worn smooth by centuries of prayer. They descend into the vaulted cellars, torches casting long shadows against curved walls. Grain sacks are lifted. The smell of rye fills the air, earthy, honest, alive. For a moment, the men simply breathe it in. Bread is baked that very day in the monastery ovens, coarse and heavy. It is divided among soldiers with trembling gratitude. Fingers that once gripped swords now cradle warm crust as though it were a relic. Some weep openly. Others bow their heads in silent thanks. A monk watches as the last loaf is carried away. His eyes glisten, but he does not speak. He knows hunger too. He knows obedience. He knows that spring will come thin this year. Outside, snow begins again to fall. It drifts across the cloister courtyard over the footprints of soldiers and monks alike. It settles upon the broken gate and the trampled herb beds. It softens edges. It conceals. But it does not erase. As the army reforms beyond the pines, bread in their bellies and smoke rising once more from campfires, a new weight settles among them. They have survived another day. They have preserved their lives. Yet something sacred has shifted. The bell within the monastery continues its steady toll, fading as distance grows. Its sound lingers in memory, mingling with the crackle of fire and the quiet murmur of men chewing in silence. The river had groaned beneath their boots. Now stone has echoed beneath their compromise. Winter has demanded tribute in many forms: flesh, faith, certainty. And the army has begun to pay. Ahead, beyond the white fields and dark forests, rumors gather like storm clouds. Lords will hear of this trespass. Bishops will speak of sacrilege. Villagers will close their gates tighter still. And among the men who eat this bread with gratitude and shame intertwined, a question will root itself deep and stubborn. If even holy walls can be broken by hunger, what boundary remains unbreached? The snow falls thicker, covering tracks that memory alone will preserve. And somewhere in the distance, another bell waits to ring. The wind drags across the plain like a grieving mother, low and unending, its voice threading through torn cloaks and hollow helmets. It carries the scent of distant pine, sharp and clean, but also the sourness of men unwashed for weeks, wool soaked in sweat and smoke, leather stiff with old rain and new frost. Snow has crusted along the hems of cloaks once dyed in proud crimson and deep blue. The colors are still there, but dulled, as if the season itself has bled them dry. Armor no longer gleams. It has become pitted and dull, flecked with rust where oil once guarded it faithfully. Chainmail rattles not with confidence, but with fatigue. Each step grinds frost into leather soles. The army moves slowly now, not in disciplined ranks, but in clusters of shivering bodies bound more by necessity than command. They drift across the white plain like fragments of something once whole. At the campaign's outset, their banners had fluttered proudly. Saints embroidered in gold thread had caught the autumn light, halos bright against azure fields. The code of their order had been recited with solemn pride: restraint towards civilians, protection of church property, obedience to feudal law. They had studied these principles beneath vaulted ceilings painted with celestial scenes, stars fixed in orderly constellations across blue plaster skies. Morality had seemed as steady as those painted heavens. Winter has obscured the stars. Clouds hang low and heavy, a gray shroud over land and thought alike. Night offers no guidance now, only a deeper cold. The certainty they once carried in their chests has thinned like breath in the wind. Supply chains have collapsed under frozen bridges, and the quiet efficiency of bandits who know desperation when they see it. Carters abandoned wagons when oxen died mid-stride, their ribs arching stark and sharp beneath sagging hides. Wheels remain half buried in ice, spokes splintered, sacks of grain long since scavenged or stolen. Salted fish ran out weeks ago. What remains is thin broth brewed from boiled nettles and strips of horsehide shaved from saddles. Men sip it slowly, as if savoring memory more than nourishment. The surgeon's tent stands near the edge of camp, canvas stiff with frost. Inside, the air reeks of vinegar and infection. A boy sits upon a crate while blackened toes are cut away with a blade heated over coals. He does not scream. He bites into a strip of leather and stares at the roof of the tent, where frost crystals shimmer faintly like a mockery of stars. Outside, the cough of camp fever spreads from one throat to another, hoarse and relentless. It travels faster than orders, faster than hope. Somewhere ahead, beyond a line of skeletal trees, a fortified manor rises from the snow. Its stone walls stand stern and unyielding, their surfaces brushed white but solid beneath. Smoke curls from chimneys in steady, confident spirals. The sight of it arrests the column as surely as a command. Inside those walls are granaries sealed against the cold. Barrels of grain stacked neatly in vaulted rooms, dried apples strung in rafters, salted meats hanging in shadowed cellars. The lord of this manor has declared neutrality, invoking ancient charters granted by a king long dead. His steward stands upon the outer wall with a parchment unrolled, reading aloud in careful Latin. By decree of the crown, protection from forced requisition without royal mandate. The words drift downward like ash, precise and lawful. They echo faintly against snow and stone. But royal decrees do not warm hands numb with cold. The men outside the walls listen in silence. Some stare at the steward with hollow eyes. Others fix their gaze upon the chimneys, watching the smoke curl skyward. They imagine hearthstones glowing amber, loaves turning golden in ovens, children asleep beneath wool blankets, unaware of the army gathered beyond their fields. Hunger strips abstraction from justice. It peels away language and leaves only need. The word neutral lands heavy in the air, sounding less like law and more like refusal. The commander rides forward alone at first. His horse's breath billows white, then vanishes. He lifts his visor and calls upward, his voice steady but thin. We seek only what we must to survive. Grant us grain, and we will pass. There is a pause. Snowflakes drift between them like hesitant messengers. The steward lowers his parchment. The charters protect this house. We answer to no army without the king's seal. The king's seal lies far behind them, in a city warmed by stone walls and treasury fires. Here, on the plain, only frost rules. The commander turns back toward his men. He sees in their faces not anger, but something heavier. Expectation. Pleading unspoken. The arithmetic of survival presses against his ribs like a mailed fist. He remembers the monastery bell ringing in witness. He remembers bread divided with trembling hands. Each boundary crossed had felt like the last. Each compromise had promised necessity. Now necessity stands before him in stone and iron. The battering ram is assembled not in rage, but in resignation. Logs are lashed together with rope stiff from frost. Shoulders lean beneath its weight. The men who lift it once recited codes of chivalry with pride. Now they grunt softly, conserving breath. The first strike against the oak doors echoes across the plain like a confession. Inside the manor, dogs bark. A child begins to cry. Servants rush to bar inner corridors. The steward's Latin falters, replaced by hurried commands. Outside, the ram strikes again. Each impact reverberates through wood and bone alike. Snow falls from the lintel in powdery cascades. The oak splinters slowly, protesting each blow. Between strikes, silence settles, a heavy, suffocating pause in which men hear their own hearts beating. When the doors finally yield, they do so with a sound less like triumph and more like surrender. The army surges forward, but not with cheers. They remove their helms as they cross the threshold, faces pale and eyes shadowed. Not to hide, because shame is too heavy to carry alongside steel. Within stone corridors lit by wavering torches, the air is warmer. It smells of bread and stored grain, of wax and wool. Soldiers move carefully, almost reverently, through halls lined with tapestries depicting hunts and harvests. They do not smash for sport. They do not shout victory. They search. Sacks are lifted. Barrels rolled. Grain spills across stone floors like pale sand. Some men kneel to scoop it with bare hands, as if afraid it might vanish. In the great hall, the lord of the manor stands rigid, flanked by servants and kin. His face is not furious, but stricken. He looks at the commander and sees not an enemy, but a mirror. Another man bent beneath forces larger than pride. "You break more than doors," the lord says quietly. The commander does not answer. Snow falls harder outside, swallowing the cries within stone corridors. It blankets the plain and the breached gate alike. It muffles hoofbeats and softens the jagged edges of broken oak. By dusk, the army moves again, heavier with grain and silence. Smoke rises from their campfires in thicker plumes. Broth tastes richer tonight. Strength returns to fingers and limbs. But something has shifted irrevocably. Honor once worn like a polished breastplate, lies buried beneath drifts that will not melt until spring. It is not gone, only hidden, waiting beneath layers of necessity and regret. As the column reforms and trudges onward across the endless white, the manor's chimneys burn lower behind them. The steward gathers splintered wood from the threshold. The lord stands long after the army disappears, watching tracks fade beneath falling snow. The wind rises again, dragging across the plain with its low lament. Ahead, darker shapes loom at the horizon, towers perhaps, or forests dense enough to hide more than hunger. The men march toward them, bound now not only by command, but by the weight of what they have done. Winter has tested their flesh. It has tested their faith. And somewhere beyond the next rise, beyond the next cluster of frozen trees, another trial waits, one that will demand not grain, but allegiance. The snow continues to fall, patient and relentless, covering the path behind them. But memory does not freeze so easily. Night deepens over the camp like ink poured slowly from a shattered vial, spreading without haste, without mercy. The last color drains from the sky until only a brittle black remains, pricked by distant stars that seem to watch without recognition. They do not flicker with guidance. They do not bend closer in pity. They hang cold and indifferent above the plain. In the center of the encampment, a single fire burns low. Its glow is thin, struggling against the weight of the dark. Smoke twists upward in narrow gray ribbons, dissolving before it can reach the heavens. Around the embers sit men who once rode beneath banners while crowds roared their names. They had competed in tournaments where trumpets blared and silk pennants snapped in the wind. Their armor had gleamed beneath summer suns, and applause had wrapped around them like a second cloak. Now their hands tremble not from battle, but from cold that gnaws at bone. Gauntlets lie discarded beside them. Fingers are raw and cracked, nails rimmed with dirt and frost. The fire reflects faintly in their eyes, but it does not warm what has begun to harden within. They remember the autumn feast before departure. The great hall had been thick with heat and laughter. Long tables lined with trenchers of venison glistening in their own juices. Wheels of cheese split open to reveal pale gold interiors. Dark rye loaves brushed with lard, their crusts crisp and fragrant. Wine spilled easily from clay jugs, staining lips and spilling across wood polished by generations of revelry. Their liege had stood at the high table, his voice rich and certain. He spoke of divine mandate, of land to be reclaimed from unworthy hands, of enemies whose defeat would secure eternal renown. The language of chivalry flowed as generously as the drink. Words like honor and righteousness rang through the rafters, bright and unchallenged. They had believed him. Winter has rewritten that language. The army has not met its foe in weeks. No clash of steel. No banners charging across open fields. Instead, they battle frost and emptiness. They march against silence. Scouts return with news that chills deeper than wind, fields barren, villages abandoned, wells frozen solid. Smoke no longer rises from many chimneys. Doors hang open, creaking in the cold, revealing rooms stripped of everything but dust and memory. The only livestock left roam thin and half wild across snow-swept meadows. Their ribs stand out like the arches of ruined chapels. One soldier kneels beside a dead horse at the edge of camp. The animal's flank is already stiff, its eye glazed with frost. He removes his glove and presses his palm briefly against its neck. "Forgive us," he whispers, though no one hears but the wind. He carves what meat remains with slow, deliberate strokes. The blade scrapes against bone. Steam rises as flesh is pulled free, pink against the white. It is shared in silence, roasted over coals with the smell of singed hair clinging stubbornly to the air. No one speaks of tournaments now. No one boasts of future glory. They chew and stare into the dark. A friar travels with the ranks, his robes patched and smoke-stained. He sits close to the fire and opens a worn manuscript, its pages warped by damp and age. He reads aloud from scripture, his voice steady despite the tremor in his breath. Blessed are those who endure. The words drift outward, fragile as frost on glass. His breath fogs the margins, blurring ink that once seemed permanent. He speaks of sacrifice and steadfastness, of trials sent to temper the faithful. He speaks of crowns not forged in gold, but in suffering. Yet when he closes the book, even he cannot ignore the hollow faces surrounding him. Faith is tested not in abundance, but in scarcity. It is easy to praise providence when tables groan with food. It is harder when bellies echo with emptiness. A cough breaks the silence. Then another. The fire gutters lower. Rumors creep through the camp like thin smoke. There is said to be a town not far from their path, stone walls intact, markets once bustling. Merchants there are rumored to hoard grain within cellars sealed by iron locks. The harvest had been stored early, protected against frost and fear. The townsfolk, so the whispers go, guard it fiercely. According to the laws of the realm, plunder without siege is dishonor. Siege, however, requires time. It requires ladders, engines, and patience. It requires supplies the army no longer possesses. A council is called beneath a sagging canopy crusted with ice. The fabric snaps softly in the wind, each gust threatening to tear it free. Torches cast uneasy light across faces carved with fatigue. The commander stands at the center, his shadow long and distorted upon the snow. Siege would starve us first, one captain murmurs, voice rough. To storm without declaration, another replies, is to cast away what little remains of our name. Name. Reputation. The very currency promised to them beneath autumn rafters. Outside the canopy, men huddle in small clusters, straining to catch fragments of the debate. They do not speak of honor now. They speak of breath, of warmth, of whether their hearts will beat long enough to see another dawn. The wind rises abruptly, sweeping across the plain in a single merciless gust. It tears at the canopy ropes and slips through seams in leather and wool. The central fire flickers wildly, then collapses inward. For a heartbeat, sparks flare bright against the dark. Then the flame dies. Smoke coils upward in a final fragile spiral before vanishing. Darkness folds in tightly around them. It presses against eyelids and seeps into thought. Without the fire's glow, the faces beneath the canopy become indistinct, reduced to outlines and breath. In that suffocating cold, the choice between reputation and survival sheds its ceremony. It is no longer a question of virtue recited in halls. It becomes a question of breath itself, of whether lungs will draw air tomorrow, of whether hearts will continue their stubborn rhythm. The commander stands silent for a long moment. Snow begins to fall again, soft and relentless, settling upon helms and shoulders. It mutes the world further, wrapping it in a shroud of white. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howls. The friar closes his manuscript and presses it against his chest. The ink within has survived wars and weather. Whether the men before him will survive this winter is less certain. The council breaks without proclamation. No trumpet announces the decision. No herald declares intent. Orders pass quietly from mouth to ear, carried like contraband through the dark. The town lies ahead. The men rise from the extinguished fire and tighten their cloaks. Frost forms along the edges of shields. Boots crunch in unison as they prepare to move before dawn. Above them, the stars remain distant and unmoved. Winter has already rewritten their language once. By morning, it may demand a final revision. And as they step away from the cold ashes toward the faint outline of walls on the horizon, the cathedral spire is barely visible through the storm. It rises in the distance like a thin blade pressed against a sky of bruised iron, all trembling behind veils of snow. Bells ring from its tower, faint and fragile, their echoes torn apart by wind before they can reach the frozen fields where the army waits. What was once a summons now arrives as a whisper, broken, almost apologetic. Snow stings exposed skin like penance. It scours cheeks raw and finds the gaps between gauntlet and sleeve. Cloaks once vibrant with heraldic beasts hang heavy with ice, their lions and griffins reduced to faded shapes beneath a glaze of frost. Colors that once proclaimed allegiance now sag in muted shades of sorrow. They had marched from that very cathedral months before. They remember the flagstones beneath their knees, chilled by autumn rain. They remember the scent of incense curling beneath high vaults painted with saints and constellations. Bishops had anointed their foreheads with oil, pressing holy thumbs against skin flushed with anticipation. Latin blessings had rolled through the nave in solemn cadence, echoing off carved pillars and gilded altars. Their cause had been proclaimed just. Their lords had promised swift victory. The enemy would fall, the land would be reclaimed, songs would be sung. They believed winter would find them home again, recounting triumph beside hearths fragrant with rosemary and roasted fowl, boots drying by the fire, while wives listened with shining eyes. They imagined themselves returned not as survivors, but as legends. Instead, winter found them here, stranded between borders, their enemy fortified beyond reach, their own provisions reduced to whispers and memory. Disease creeps through the camp like a second army, one that does not raise banners or shout defiance. Dysentery spreads from fouled water hauled through cracked buckets. Ague clings to men who march too long through stagnant marsh air. The leech's tent is crowded, canvas walls damp and sagging. Inside, the floor is strewn with bloody linen and bowls of cloudy water. A man groans softly while a blade opens his arm to release bad humors, as though darkness itself might drain away. The smell of vinegar and sickness mingles with smoke. Hunger amplifies every wound. A cut that would have closed in summer festers now, rimmed with black. The bells from the distant cathedral ring again, swallowed by the storm. Beyond the ridge, along a road half hidden beneath drifts, a caravan appears. At first, it is only movement against the white horizon, dark shapes descending in cautious line. Then the wagons become clear, their wooden frames sturdy and well-kept. Flemish cloth merchants wrapped in layered furs walk beside them. Jewish financiers ride under the protection of royal charter, parchment sealed with wax and bearing the king's signature tucked safely in leather cases. The grain within the wagons is meant for urban markets, for cities where coin still clinks in taverns and ovens burn bright behind thick walls. The charter grants these traders safe passage under threat of severe penalty to any who interfere. It is law, sealed and witnessed. The army watches from the plain. From this distance, the sacks of grain are visible even to weary eyes, pale bulges stacked high against dark wood. They stand out like lanterns in fog, like salvation. The traders trust the law to shield them. They do not yet see the calculation forming behind hollow eyes. And somewhere within its stone walls, prayers rise for justice. Out here, beneath a sky that offers no answer, the army marches on, fed, strengthened, and altered. Winter has taken their certainty. Hunger has taken their innocence. What remains as they turn their backs on the fading bells is a question heavier than any sack of grain. When spring finally comes, who will they be? Silence behind them feels heavier than any enemy waiting ahead. And somewhere within its stone walls, prayers rise for justice. Out here, beneath a sky that offers no answer, the army marches on, fed, strengthened, and altered. Winter has taken their certainty. Hunger has taken their innocence. What remains as they turn their backs on the fading bells is a question heavier than any sack of grain. When spring finally comes, who will they be? Silence behind them feels heavier than any enemy waiting ahead.